So back in 2018, I was invited out to a walled garden as part of a Grade 2 listed hall that was absolutely incredible. This design was not without challenges, but it's certainly turned into one of my favourite gardens that I've designed and built over the years. And I thought I'd talk to you a little bit more about it and show you how we got on. The walled garden was attached to the ground floor apartment of this fantastic conversion, which was redeveloped in 2010. As you can see from the bird's eye view here, it had been landscaped in keeping with the hall. Somebody had obviously put quite a bit of thought into the design. On first glance, the garden seemed relatively flat, and the idea of a walled garden was a fantastic challenge. However, due to the scale of the hall itself and a lot of the trees around it, the rendered walls that had been put in actually made the garden feel a little bit smaller and quite enclosed. The clients themselves were a professional couple, very busy, with a teenage daughter and a couple of dogs. So to have the lawn in 4 individual segments with the small seating in the area in the middle just didn't really work for them. Their brief consisted of 6 key requests. First of all, they wanted a better view from their kitchen. They needed space for a jacuzzi that they really wanted. Improved planting that encouraged them to get out in the garden and do some gardening. Space to relax and to entertain in. And they wanted lighting to extend their view out in an evening. Because they work so hard, they were often not there until gone 5 o'clock. And in the winter months, even autumn and spring, early spring, meant that they didn't really see much of their garden during the week. And finally, they also wanted to disguise or at least minimise the impact of the dog's kennel, as these were working dogs and they were kept and lived outside. The idea of a jacuzzi, although I could understand why they wanted one, was a slight concern given that the hall itself and the gardens were potentially quite classical, and most jacuzzis are a little bit plasticky and can often draw the eye to them, which is definitely something I didn't want within this garden. Therefore, I suggested that perhaps we look at some sort of cladding or potentially hiding the jacuzzi in some way. I did think about sinking the jacuzzi right down. However, the clients also highlighted that the garden itself often became a little bit waterlogged. I think the fact that there were walls around there did ring alarm bells, because clearly what I didn't want to do was to create some drainage and then find that I couldn't get that drainage out of the garden. I then carried out the survey, so I spent quite a bit of time measuring, looking at the space, dug a few test holes as well, and discovered that those walls had been built on some quite substantial footings, and therefore taking drainage out of the garden wasn't really an option. The garden itself looked relatively flat at first inspection. However, when I got the zip level out, discovered that there was actually around a 400mm fall from the back of the garden towards the hall. And I decided that the level variation would actually potentially be quite a benefit to the garden design, as what we'd be able to do is perhaps create some level changes which would blur the idea of this flat garden going up onto a retaining wall all the way around. Finally, I noted that clearly the hall was listed, as you'd expect, Grade 2 listed. Therefore, we'd need to get the conservation officer and the listed buildings inspector involved. There's probably going to be a need for planning permission. Also, because the building had been split into apartments, there would be a management company. So I discussed with the client that we would need to get them involved, or at least talk to them a little bit about what we were hoping for. And I would need to think quite carefully about how we designed the garden so it was in keeping, or at least sympathetic to the hall, not your standard or necessarily easy garden design to start with. So I got set up on the drawing board, started sketching, and came up with an initial concept relatively quickly actually. I used a bit of a grid format and started playing around with zoning the different elements that within the garden that the client had requested. Now, if you're not familiar with zoning, you might want to check out my video on how to design a small garden. There's a link there above right now, where I talk a lot more about zoning and how you can start off a design with the client brief in mind. I wanted to keep the design relatively modern in its structure and layout, just because, as I say, the interior of the apartment was fairly modern. Equally, we were going to balance this with classical materials potentially, or elements that would then tie that in with the hall. So the first thing I looked at when it came to the zoning was obviously the dog kennel was quite an important element for them. Really we had to be quite careful with that. We couldn't have that in anywhere where there was going to be full sun, and because the hall itself, or this particular garden, was northeast facing, the dog kennel needed to go tight up against the building so that it didn't get that sort of late morning to early afternoon sunshine. Then thought a little bit about the jacuzzi. Again, what we don't want is for that to be the pride of place, or the clear viewpoint from the kitchen, so we wanted to put that off to the side. However, did think that we wanted to make that area somewhat inviting, so when you went into the garden you did see it, and I thought fairly early on about the idea of a pergola that would balance the height of any jacuzzi that we put in, which would also potentially create a frame, whether it be looking in or out of the garden. Then when it came to the dining area, I'm always a big one when it comes to trying to create a dining area that gets perhaps a late afternoon or early evening sunshine. I love spending time in the morning in my garden, but the evening tends to trump the morning, so we popped that in the west facing element of the garden. And then it was really a case of tying those areas together with pathways. Early on, the client had talked a little bit about how they wanted to retain a lawn. It wasn't really that they wanted a space to play on. Obviously the daughter was a little bit older. They had all these grounds that the dogs could run around in, but you know, us Brits love a lawn, and the greenery actually was going to balance the hard landscaping and the white walls quite well, so that was good. Planting beds were then added. Thought quite a bit about height and trees. Again, the other element that I need to think quite carefully about when I placed the jacuzzi and the dog kennel where they were was we needed something to divide that. Clearly when you sat in the jacuzzi you don't really want the dogs woofing at you. So what we did was, I allowed for some yew hedging within the garden as well, and create some privacy from the communal areas looking in as well, because there was some wrought iron gates that looked into the garden. So that went in fairly early on. And then messed around with some of the pathways, created some divisions, some stepping in and out, as you can see from that plan, just to create some wider flower beds and a bit more interest as you're walking around really. And so I presented this to the client. Overall they really liked it. There wasn't any major changes required. They asked for some fruit trees potentially within the garden, and I thought these might work quite well if they were fan trained against the wall. Again, we're sticking with that sort of classical feel of an old English garden. I thought that could work quite well. I'd also thought about perhaps a water feature as well, and perhaps having some sort of height from that water feature so that you could see it from the kitchen. We talked about that, and perhaps a wisteria growing up either side of it. And then there were a few colour requests, various little sort of elements that the client wanted, but got that signed off and moved on to the next step. And it's the same with any garden. When I know that the client likes the concept and we've got that to that point, really at this stage now I need to refine the details down and really nail down what we're doing and how we're going to do it. One of the first areas that I started thinking very carefully about then was this jacuzzi area. Now earlier on in the design stage, I had a client who had found a cedar jacuzzi, or a jacuzzi made from cedar boards from a company called Riviera, and I thought this would be a great option. Presented it to the client, explained, we looked at some costings, and luckily the client had the budget to be able to afford it. But these tubs are actually quite tall compared to your standard jacuzzi. They've also got heating elements and pipe work that is separate to it, because it's kind of like a barrel shape. And although I wasn't able to sink the jacuzzi, I started thinking about the idea that because we were stepping up the garden, that we could create a bit of a pad at a ground level, the step up around it. We could incorporate some drainage on either side, and then if we put in a deck here, then that would roughly cover around about a quarter of the size, or 25% of the total height, thus softening the impact that this had. Now I mentioned about the incorporating the yew or the taxus hedging into the garden. This was quite an easy choice, I thought, because obviously we needed this English classical feel to the space. Taxus has obviously been used in a lot of period building and gardens, and so because we were going to need to involve the listed buildings officer and the conservation officer, that felt like a decision that would work well. Moving on with the materials and this idea of needing to be quite considerate when it comes to the hall itself, we started thinking about paving. Now the hall itself was constructed with a lovely sort of warm sandstone, I did consider this, however, the problem with sandstone is it often, when it's used on a vertical surface, it's fine, but as a horizontal surface, it tends to get quite damp, and over the winter time, this can create a lot of algae. It can become slippery. We then get lichen and mosses and things like that. So it's not really the perfect material for a lower maintenance garden, and certainly not one that's going to require an awful lot of pressure washing and cleaning. So we looked at porcelain and we settled on this lovely warm beige porcelain from London Stone. I then wanted to add a bit of a contrast when it came to the steps and the pathways, so we went for some clay pavers, and I found this lovely grey, Lucca grey clay paver. The idea of the grey was this was going to tone in with some of the stone sills and framing of the windows of the hall, but also the copings of the retaining wall, which were quite grey. And because we were thinking about timber within the garden as well, this seemed like an obvious choice. Now, I mentioned just then timber, and there's nothing more Old English than oak. So the pergola seemed like an obvious choice to do this in oak. Now, around the jacuzzi area though, I thought it'd be really nice to have this decking, as I said before, not just because of colour or texture or what have you, but because it's a softer material. If you're getting in and out of a jacuzzi with bare feet, timber seemed like a really nice option. It meant we could raise that platform up, as I mentioned before, to sort of hide some of the pipework and things for the jacuzzi. Now, the only difficulty with that was using green oak. It often splits, it moves, it twists, you know. Certainly didn't want that when it came to the decking, so spent a bit of time researching this and found that a company called Roundwoods of Mayfield supplied a beautiful kiln-dried oak decking, which was really good. Required a little bit of a treatment so as to avoid rot and infestation in the future, but it would allow it to then mellow down and have this lovely silvery tones, which would tie in perfectly, as I say, with the green oak pergola that we were going to be installing. Back to the planting as well as the yew hedging. Now, I don't tend to go into great depth when it comes to the planting plan at the outline master plan stage, but I did want to get some trees in there as per the concept, and I thought multi-stemmed Amelanchias, they don't grow too big, they're going to create year-round interest, they're quite modern in the garden design world, so that seemed like a good idea. Put a few of those in, but also a Cornus Cusa chinensis gave a little bit of variation, and I thought this could go nicely in with the deeper flower bed. And finally, water feature, spent quite a long time on this. Originally, I'd imagine that we'd probably have something like a bit of a water blade, perhaps some water falling down into a pool. However, this felt a little bit too contemporary, a bit too away from this classical balance that we were trying to achieve. So changed this for a fairly simple water wall option. What we did was we created a reservoir at the top of this structure and a water reservoir at the bottom, a pool that we were going to fill with perhaps paddle stones to give a bit of texture and interest at the bottom, relatively shallow, and the intention was always to chemically treat it. Decided early on to clad this in the sandstone paving, however, thought that what we could do there was to cut it into linear pieces, thus to create a little bit more texture, creating a little bit more movement as the water ran down it. And at this stage, once we've got this all wrapped up and the client had signed it off, we decided that it was at that point we should consult with the council, get a pre-application planning inquiry out there, talk to the listed buildings officer as well as the conservation officer. Luckily, they came back with everything being relatively positive. They did confirm that we'd need planning permission primarily because of the pergola and also some of the raised elements. But it was great to hear that was considered positive, and so that allowed us then to move on and really get the ball rolling with the final design pack. So with the final design pack, first thing we really wanted to get right was the planting. Spent a bit of time looking at this and talking to the client. We decided that purples, whites, lots of greens, perhaps a few splashes of yellow, some lime greens would work really, really well. Maybe some red stems for winter interest, I think I suggested. And I came up with this mood board for the planting. Now, I tend to find these mood boards work really well when it comes to presenting planting to the client. Primarily because a lot of people, if they're really, really busy, they don't have time to Google lots of Latin names. And if I give them a planting plan straight off with all these names, it's not really going to give them an instant impact of whether or not they like what I'm suggesting or not. But then this is the final planting plan, which again was then able to be agreed relatively quickly. And we took the planting list, sent it off to our usual nursery, As I say, we then dotted the I's, crossed the T's when it came to the design, double checked that everything was going to work really well, and submitted the planning application so that the garden could go in with the intention of being built early in the following year. So in late November, we got the good news that planning permission had been granted. We had the blessing from the listed buildings officer and conservation officer, and the management company for the development had agreed that this was all okay. So we were all systems go in planning for the build. So on January 24th, 2019, we officially broke ground. The very first task was to remove everything that wasn't needed, which was quite a lot actually. We did take care to remove the bay trees as well as a lot of the plants, and they were very quickly snaffled up by the neighbours of the local houses in the estate. We then got the jacuzzi basin as well as the drainage, and a lot of the hardcore went down for the pathways. We do this as quick as we can when it comes to this sort of garden, especially at this time of year, so as to minimise the mud being traipsed around the site. The next thing was to get the jacuzzi built, which the suppliers did very quickly and very efficiently, which was great. We were able then to put in the deck frame, the pergola posts, and start building some of the retaining walls, which we'd also decided to do using green oak sleepers. Trees are one of those things that they're best to get in your garden as soon as possible because they take a long time to mature. But with a garden like this, I felt that it was really important that we got as mature trees as we could right from the outset. But the difficulty with that is there's a cost involved. And it's not just a cost of the trees itself. The trees that we eventually sourced were in fact close to 300 kilos each, and so they weren't something that we could simply wheelbarrow into the garden. Because of the position of the walled garden as well, we weren't able to simply high-ab these off a lorry into position either. And after speaking to the tree nursery, we managed to find a company who used a machine called a hooker. Now this is a machine that can lift several tons with its own little high-ab. It's tracked so it can go over soft and hard ground alike, and it can fit through a gap just 900 millimeters wide. So this seemed like a great option. Came with a driver who was absolutely excellent when it came to his care, and it meant that we were able to get all these trees in with very little risk to our staff. And they were brought in efficiently and quickly so that we could get them in the ground straight away. We then secured them with ground anchors, so there was no need for any posts or what have you, and they were able to be left straight away, buried to start establishing their root systems immediately. We were then on to the finishing products and details. There were a lot of details that went into this garden, and a lot of extra effort that was brought in just to ensure that all these little items created an overall high quality garden. It wasn't just our effort, some of the suppliers were fantastic. We had these amazing step treads made from London Stone with a downturn on the porcelain, and the water feature, the timber work, this all just brought together, creating a great final finish. The electrician was then brought in, and then the planting team came in to do the final touches, and after 3 long months the garden was finished and ready for the client, just in time for spring. Now, I was also sent this fantastic drone shot from the client. I'm not quite sure how they had it done or who did it, but thank you to them for sending that through. I think it really shows what we were able to achieve. Now, earlier this year, I went back to see the garden as our maintenance team were there, just giving it a bit of a sort out following quite a difficult winter. I really wanted to see how the plants had been maturing just 4 years after we'd completed the build, and this is what I found.
Baby, I beg you, yeah. my shoes last night. I don't know where I put my keys. I was tired and fell asleep beneath an oak tree. I bet my mother's proud of me, from each scar upon my knuckle and each graze upon my knee. And all I know is I got a cab and then threw up upon his car seat. He kicked me out and then I walked in the rain. I tell myself in every way I won't be doing this again, and tomorrow's a brand new day. Someone told me, always say what's on your mind, and I am only being honest with you. I get lonely and make mistakes from time to time. Say no man call, yeah. Baby, I beg you, yeah. Oh, baby, I beg you, yeah, 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 yeah. Baby, I beg you, yeah. I remember less and less, and mostly things that I regret. In my phone are several texts from girls I've never met, and in the pocket of my jeans are only coins and broken dreams. My heart is breaking at the seams, and I'm coming apart now. Now things are looking up, I'll find my shoes right.
So there you go. I hope you think that was worthwhile sharing with you. Do let me know if you'd like to see any more case studies. I'm sure I can bring another one to you very soon, as well as our usual how-to videos. If you did enjoy the video, don't forget to give us a like or share this with your friends and family. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe. All helps. Otherwise, I hope that you can get out in the garden later on this week. Here in the UK, it's still raining and getting cooler as we head towards the Christmas period. Otherwise, I'll see you all very soon.